She'll never understand business. She's just comfortable being my wife." Ethan Caldwell said it laughing, leaning back in his chair, another woman at his side, never once glancing at the door he'd left open. He didn't know his wife was standing right there holding the anniversary lunch she'd made him with her own hands, hearing him call 12 years of love a convenience. He thought her silence was weakness. He thought her kindness was something he could step on. He had no idea the quiet woman in that doorway had built the very empire he was bragging about, and that she'd just decided to take it all back. Before we begin, if stories about quiet people who finally rise up move you, please subscribe to this channel and stay with me all the way to the end, because this one gets bigger with every part. And do me a favor, comment the name of the city where you're watching from right now so I can see just how far Claire's story travels tonight. Now let's begin. Claire Bennett Caldwell had left the house that morning with a lightness in her chest she hadn't felt in months. It was their anniversary. 12 years. And though Ethan had grown distant lately, buried under quarterly reports and midnight phone calls, she told herself that was simply the price of building something great. She had told herself a lot of things over the years. That was one of her talents. She could take a hard truth and wrap it in kindness until it stopped cutting. So she made his lunch herself. Not because they couldn't afford a private chef they employed too, but because she remembered a version of Ethan who used to close his eyes when he ate her roasted chicken and say, "You are the only good thing I've ever done right." She wanted to remind him of that man. She wanted to remind herself. The drive downtown took 40 minutes. Chicago traffic was merciless in the early afternoon, but she didn't mind. She hummed along to an old song on the radio, the kind of song that made her think of the small apartment they used to share, the one with the broken heater and the mattress on the floor, back when the only empire they owned was each other. She carried the lunch through the glass lobby of Caldwell Innovations, and the receptionist smiled at her, the way people always smiled at Claire, warmly, a little curiously, as if trying to figure out how someone so gentle had ended up married to a man like Ethan. "Mrs. Caldwell, so good to see you," the young woman said. "Should I call up to let Mr. Caldwell know you're here?" Claire touched a finger to her lips and shook her head. "It's a surprise," she whispered. "It's our anniversary." The receptionist's smile faltered for just a moment. Just a flicker. Claire didn't notice it then. She would remember it later, though. She would remember the way the young woman's eyes dropped to the desk, the way her voice went a little too bright when she said, "Of course, congratulations." The elevator ride to the executive floor was smooth and silent. Claire watched the numbers climb and adjusted the ribbon on the small gift she'd tucked beside the lunch. A watch. Not a flashy one, a simple one engraved on the back with a single line. "For the man who taught me to dream bigger." She had chosen those words carefully. She always chose her words carefully. It was one more thing about Claire that people mistook for softness. The doors opened onto the executive floor, and the first thing she noticed was how quiet it was. Ethan's assistants usually buzzed around like the whole building might collapse without them. But the outer office was empty. A phone rang somewhere and went unanswered. And then she heard it. Laughter. Ethan's laughter coming from his office, low and easy and intimate, in a way she hadn't heard in a very long time. And beneath it, another laugh. A woman's. Light. Playful. Claire's steps slowed. The door to his office was slightly open. Not much, just a few inches. But enough. She should have knocked. She should have announced herself. Later, she would ask herself 1,000 times why she didn't. But something in that laughter froze her feet to the floor, and instead of walking in, she simply stood there in the empty outer office, holding a lunch that was already going cold. "You worry too much," Ethan was saying inside. "Nobody's gonna find out." "I'm not worried about being found out," the woman answered. "I'm worried about you. You've been carrying this whole thing on your back for years. When was the last time anyone took care of you, Ethan?" There was a pause. Claire's heart began to pound. "Honestly," Ethan said, "I don't remember. Claire tries, I guess, but it's not the same. She doesn't get it. She doesn't get me." Claire's fingers tightened around the paper bag. "She's a sweet woman," Ethan went on, and the way he said it, gentle, dismissive, the way a person talks about an old dog, cut deeper than anything else could have. "But she'll never understand business. She's just comfortable being my wife. She doesn't even know how the real world works. I could tell her the company was on fire, and she'd ask me if I wanted her to make me a sandwich." The woman laughed, and Ethan laughed too. Claire stood perfectly still. Something inside her, something that had been holding a certain shape for 12 years, quietly cracked. "Come on," the woman said, her voice dropping lower. "You deserve someone who sees you, really sees you, the man who built all of this." "Yeah," Ethan murmured. "Yeah, I did build all of this, didn't I?" And that was the moment. Not the affair, not the woman's voice, not even the cruelty. It was those 5 words. "Yeah, I did build all of this," because Claire knew the truth. Claire, who never raised her voice, who never demanded credit, who had spent years watching her husband stand on stages and accept awards for work she had done with her own 2 hands in the dark hours of 1,000 nights. Claire knew exactly who had built all of this, and it wasn't him. She looked down at the lunch in her hands, the watch, the ribbon, the engraving, "For the man who taught me to dream bigger." She almost laughed. It came out instead as a single silent breath. Then very calmly, Claire turned and walked back to the elevator. She did not scream. She did not cry. She did not push the door open and hurl the lunch at his head the way another woman might have. Every instinct in her body told her to make him feel it, to let him see what he'd done to her face. But Claire had learned long ago that the loudest reactions were the weakest. The people who screamed were the people who had no other move. And Claire always had another move. She pressed the elevator button. She waited. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished metal doors, and she barely recognized the woman looking back. There was something new in that woman's eyes, something cold and clear and very, very awake. The elevator arrived. She stepped inside. The doors slid shut, sealing away the sound of her husband's laughter. On the way down, she set the lunch on the elevator floor. She unwrapped the watch, looked at it one last time, and slipped it into her coat pocket. She would keep it, not as a memory of Ethan, as a reminder of the exact moment she stopped being a fool. By the time she reached the lobby, her face was serene. The receptionist looked up nervously. "Mrs. Caldwell, did you find him? Is everything—" "Everything's fine," Claire said softly, and she even smiled. "Thank you. Have a lovely afternoon." She walked out into the Chicago sunlight, and she did not look back at the building that bore her husband's name and her mind. In the car, she sat for a long moment without turning the key. Her hands were steady. That surprised her. She had expected them to shake. Then she took out her phone, scrolled to a number she had saved 8 years ago and never once had reason to use, and pressed call. It rang twice. "Bennett," a woman's crisp voice answered. Margaret Cole, one of the most feared corporate attorneys in the state of Illinois, and the only person alive besides Claire who knew what was really buried in the foundation of Caldwell Innovations. "Margaret," Claire said, "it's Claire. I think it's time." There was a pause on the line. When Margaret spoke again, her voice had changed. It had sharpened. "Are you sure? Once we open this door, Claire, there is no closing it. You understand that?" Claire looked up at the tower of glass and steel rising above the street at the name Caldwell blazing across the top in silver letters. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," she said. To understand what Claire did next, you have to understand who Claire really was. Because the story the world believed, the story of the quiet, pretty wife who married up, who spent her days shopping and lunching and standing decoratively beside her brilliant husband, that story was a lie. And it was a lie Claire herself had helped build, brick by brick. 15 years earlier, Claire Bennett had been a graduate student at MIT, one of the sharpest minds in her doctoral program in computer science. Her professors used to say she thought in code the way musicians think in melody. She could look at a broken system and see the fix hanging in the air like it was written on the wall. She wasn't just good, she was rare. She met Ethan Caldwell at a startup mixer in Boston. He was charming, ambitious, hungry, a business student with a silver tongue and a head full of dreams, and absolutely no idea how to build any of them. He talked a beautiful game. He could walk into a room of investors and make them believe the sun rose because he asked it to, but he couldn't build a thing. Claire could. They fell in love the way opposites do, fast and hard, each one dazzled by the thing they lacked. He loved her mind, she loved his fire. And together in that little apartment with the broken heater, they dreamed up a company. The idea was Ethan's in the loosest sense. He wanted to build artificial intelligence that could predict market behavior, a system smart enough to make banks and corporations depend on it. It was a grand vision. It was also, at that point, nothing but words. Claire made it real. For 3 years, she wrote the code that became the heart of Caldwell Innovations. She designed the core algorithms, the predictive models, the neural architecture that would eventually be worth billions. She solved problems that experts twice her age had called impossible. She did it at night, on weekends, through fevers and exhaustion, and one terrible winter when they couldn't afford to fix the heater, and she typed in fingerless gloves. And when the company was ready to launch, they made a decision. Together they told themselves. But really, it was Ethan's idea dressed up in reasonable language. Investors want a face, he'd said. They want a founder they can picture, a CEO. And no offense, sweetheart, but they see a woman engineer and they get nervous. It's not fair. It's not right. But it's the world. Let me be the face. Let me handle the money and the meetings and the press. You handle the technology. You'll be the real power. Everybody who matters will know. And Claire, who loved him, who trusted him, who genuinely did not care about spotlights and titles, said yes. But Claire was not naive. She was gentle, but she was not naive. And so before she signed a single document, she did one quiet thing that Ethan never knew about. She kept the technology in her own name. The core patents, the foundational algorithms, the intellectual property that the entire company was built on, she licensed it to Caldwell Innovations through a separate holding entity. On paper, the company had the right to use the technology, but the technology itself, the actual crown jewels, belonged to a private trust that Claire controlled, and Ethan had never bothered to read the fine print on. She hadn't done it out of suspicion. She'd done it because Margaret Cole, her mentor and lawyer, had looked her in the eye all those years ago and said, "Claire, I'm going to give you the only piece of advice that matters. Love your husband, but never, ever hand a man the only thing that's truly yours. Protect yourself. Because the day you need that protection, it will already be too late to build it." Claire had listened. She had built the protection, and then she had spent 12 years praying she would never need it. She had folded that document into the deepest drawer of her mind and closed it. She had watched Ethan accept the awards. She had smiled at the galas while reporters called him a genius. She had stood beside him at the launch of every product she had designed, and when he said, "I built this," she had squeezed his hand and said nothing because she truly believed that a partnership didn't need applause to be real. She had believed they were a team until she stood outside a door and heard him call her a burden. Heard him say she didn't understand the real world. Heard him laugh with another woman and say, "Yeah, I built all of this, didn't I?" And in that moment, 12 years of quiet devotion turned into something else entirely. Not rage. Rage was loud. This was quieter and far more dangerous. This was clarity. Back in her car, Claire ended the call with Margaret and sat for a while watching the city move around her. People hurried past on the sidewalk, wrapped up in their own lives, and not one of them knew that a woman in a parked car had just made a decision that would collapse a billion-dollar empire. She thought about the woman in Ethan's office. Olivia, the new assistant, young, pretty, ambitious. Claire felt no hatred toward her. Isn't that strange? She searched herself for it and found only a strange, distant pity. Whoever that girl was, she had thrown her lot in with the wrong man. She just didn't know it yet. Claire started the car. She did not drive home. She drove instead to a small office on the north side of the city, a place she owned under her maiden name. A place Ethan had never once visited in 12 years of marriage, because it had never occurred to him that his wife might have somewhere to go. It was a quiet office, 2 rooms, a desk, a server, and on that server, backed up in 3 separate locations, sat the beating heart of Caldwell Innovations, the source code, the master keys, the licensing architecture, all of it sitting patiently under Claire's control, waiting for a day she had hoped would never come. She sat down at the desk. She opened her laptop, and for the first time in 12 years, Claire Bennett stopped being the woman behind the man. She started being herself. That evening, Ethan came home late as he always did. He walked into the mansion smelling of expensive cologne and someone else's perfume, and he found Claire in the kitchen calmly setting the table for two. "Hey," he said, surprised. "I didn't think you'd wait up." "It's our anniversary," Claire said, and she smiled at him, warmly, perfectly. 12 years, I made your favorite. Something flickered across Ethan's face. Guilt, maybe? Or just the mild discomfort of a man who had forgotten and been caught. "Right," he said. 12 years, of course. "I'm sorry I'm late. Big things happening at the office. You wouldn't believe the pressure I'm under." "I'm sure I wouldn't," Claire said sweetly, and she set a plate in front of him. "Sit, eat. Tell me all about it." And Ethan, who had spent the afternoon laughing about how his wife didn't understand the real world, sat down at the table she'd set and let her serve him dinner, never once suspecting that the gentle hands passing him his plate had just hours earlier begun the quiet work of dismantling everything he had. He talked about himself all through dinner. He always did. He talked about a deal that was about to close, about how the board loved him, about how he was going to be on the cover of a magazine. Claire nodded and smiled and asked all the right questions, and inside, behind her calm eyes, a clock was ticking. "You know," Ethan said at one point, leaning back swirling his wine, "I don't say it enough, but I'm glad I have you. A guy like me needs someone steady at home, someone simple, no offense." "None taken," Claire said. "You keep me grounded." He went on, warming to his own generosity. "Not everybody's built to be out there in the arena taking the hits, making the big calls. Some people are just meant to hold down the home front, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's honor in it." Claire looked at her husband for a long moment. "You really believe that, don't you?" she said quietly. "That I'm simple, that I hold down the home front." Ethan blinked, sensing something in her tone, but too full of himself to read it. "I mean it as a compliment, babe." "I know you do," Claire said. "That's the part that amazes me." He didn't understand what she meant. Of course he didn't. And that more than anything was the tragedy of Ethan Caldwell. He had lived beside a genius for 15 years and had convinced himself he was the smart one. After dinner, Claire cleared the plates. Ethan retreated to his study to take a call, and through the door, she heard him laughing again, that same low, easy laugh. She recognized it now. It was the laugh of a man who thought he'd gotten away with something. Claire washed the dishes by hand. She dried each one carefully and put it away. And when she was finished, she went upstairs, sat on the edge of the bed they'd shared for a decade, and took out her phone. There was a message from Margaret. 3 words. "Everything is ready." Claire read it twice. Then she set the phone down, and for one moment, just one, she let herself feel it. The grief. Not for the man Ethan was. For the man she'd thought he was. For the young couple in the apartment with the broken heater, for the girl in the fingerless gloves who had typed a fortune into existence because she believed in the boy sitting next to her. That girl deserved better, and Claire was finally going to give it to her. She picked the phone back up and typed her reply. "Then let's begin. First thing in the morning." She turned off the light. Down the hall in his study, Ethan Caldwell was still laughing, still dreaming of magazine covers, still absolutely certain that he was the most powerful man in any room he walked into. He had no idea that the most powerful person in his life had just gone to sleep in the next room, calm as still water, having decided to end him. He had no idea that the woman he'd called simple had built the very ground he stood on. And he had no idea that tomorrow morning when he walked into his office feeling like a king, a folder would be waiting on his desk that would take it all away. Claire lay in the dark, listening to the distant sound of her husband's satisfaction, and she felt for the first time in years completely at peace. She had spent 12 years being the quiet woman behind the great man. She was done being quiet. The empire had a foundation, and in the morning the foundation was going to walk away. Morning came gray and cold over the city. Ethan rose early as he always did and stood in front of the mirror admiring the man he saw there. He picked out his most expensive tie. He had a good feeling about today. The Hartwell deal was about to close. The board meeting was going to be a triumph, and he was in his own estimation unstoppable. Claire was already downstairs when he came down dressed, simply a cup of coffee in her hands, watching the sunrise through the tall windows. "You're up early," Ethan said, grabbing his own cup. "Couldn't sleep," Claire said. "Big day." Ethan chuckled. "Every day's a big day when you're me." He kissed the top of her head, a careless automatic gesture, and headed for the door. Then he paused. "Hey, whatever you've got planned today, shopping, lunch, whatever, have fun. You've earned it. Being married to me isn't easy." He grinned at his own joke. Claire turned and looked at him, and there was something in her face he almost noticed. Almost. "Have a good day at the office, Ethan," she said softly. "Always do," he said, and he was gone. Claire watched his car pull out of the drive and disappear down the street. Then she set down her coffee, walked to the study, and opened her laptop. She logged into a system that only she had access to. Her fingers moved across the keys with the calm certainty of a surgeon. And 40 minutes later, as Ethan Caldwell rode the elevator up to his executive floor, whistling, straightening his expensive tie, the first thing he saw when the doors opened was Margaret Cole standing in the middle of his office in a gray suit, holding a single manila folder flanked by two people he didn't recognize. "Mr. Caldwell," Margaret said, and her voice was the sound of a door slamming shut. "We need to talk about who really owns your company." Ethan laughed. He actually laughed. "I'm sorry," he said. "Who the hell are you, and how did you get into my office?" Margaret set the folder down on his desk and slid it across the polished surface toward him. "I represent the Bennett Trust," she said, "and as of 6 o'clock this morning, every piece of technology this company depends on has been legally suspended pending review of your licensing rights." She paused. "Which I should tell you, Mr. Caldwell, you do not actually have." Ethan stared at her. Then he laughed again, but it was a thinner laugh now, a little uncertain. "This is a joke," he said. "Somebody put you up to this. Is this a prank because it's not funny?" He looked at the folder. He didn't open it. "I built this company. Every line of code, every system, every product. It's mine. It has my name on the building, for God's sake." "Yes," Margaret said quietly. "It has your name on the building." She let that sit for a moment. "But your name isn't on the technology. It never was." Ethan's smile finally began to slip. "Open the folder, Mr. Caldwell," Margaret said, and somewhere across the city, in a quiet office with 2 rooms and a desk and a server humming softly in the corner, Claire Bennett sat back in her chair, closed her eyes, and let out a long, slow breath she felt like she had been holding for 12 years. It had begun. The empire was already falling, and the woman he'd called simple was just getting started. Ethan opened the folder. His eyes moved down the first page, then the second, and Margaret watched the color drain out of his face, the way water drains out of a cracked glass. He read the words trust and licensor and revocation of rights, and he read the name at the bottom of every document, the name that appeared over and over like a heartbeat he'd never bothered to listen for. Claire Bennett. Claire Bennett. Claire Bennett. "This is fake," he said, but his voice had lost its bottom. "This is forged. Claire didn't do this. Claire couldn't do this. She doesn't even know how to read a licensing agreement." "She wrote the licensing agreement, Mr. Caldwell," Margaret said, 12 years ago. "In this office, I might add, while you were out at a fundraiser accepting an award for innovation." Ethan looked up sharply. "That's a lie." "Is it?" Margaret tilted her head. "Then explain to me why the core patent for your predictive engine, the one your entire valuation rests on, was filed under the Bennett Trust in 2011. Explain why you've been paying licensing fees to a holding company for 11 years without ever once asking who owned it. It was in your quarterly reports, Mr. Caldwell. Line item, technology licensing. You signed off on it every single quarter." She smiled thin and cold. "You just never read it." And there it was. The thing that had always been true about Ethan Caldwell laid bare on his own desk. He never read the details. He never had. He'd built an entire identity around being the big-picture man, the visionary, the one who didn't get bogged down in fine print. And that arrogance, that lazy, glittering arrogance, was about to cost him everything. He grabbed the desk phone and stabbed at a button. "Get me legal, now, and get me my wife on the phone." "Your legal team already knows," Margaret said. "I spoke with your general counsel at 5:45 this morning. He's the one who advised your board to take this seriously." She paused. "As for your wife, I wouldn't call her Mrs. Caldwell anymore if I were you. She's asked me to inform you that she'll be filing for divorce this afternoon. Irreconcilable differences. Another pause, and this one had a blade in it. Apparently, she doesn't understand the real world, but she understands you. Ethan froze with the phone halfway to his ear. She heard. The thought hit him like ice water down the spine. She heard me. Yesterday, in the office. She was there. The lunch. He remembered now dimly that the receptionist had mentioned something when he came down that his wife had stopped by and left without saying goodbye. He hadn't thought a thing of it. He'd been too busy with Olivia, too busy laughing. She heard everything. He set the phone down very slowly. 6 hours earlier, Claire had made him dinner. She had smiled at him across the table. She had asked him about his day and listened while he called her simple, while he told her there was honor in holding down the home front. She had washed the dishes by hand, and the entire time this had already been in motion. The entire time she had already decided to burn his kingdom to the ground, and she had served him his favorite meal while she did it. For the first time in his adult life, Ethan Caldwell felt something he did not recognize. He felt afraid. 9:15 in the morning. That was the moment the fear started, and it would not leave him again. Across the city, Claire's phone buzzed. A text from Margaret. He's read it. He's calling legal. He knows you heard him. Claire looked at the message for a long moment. She waited to feel triumphant. She didn't. She felt hollow and calm and a little sad, the way you feel at a funeral for someone you stopped loving a long time ago. She typed back a single word. Good. Then she set the phone face down and got back to work because there was a great deal of work still to do, and grief could wait its turn. Ethan's morning collapsed like a building with its supports cut. By 10 o'clock, the company's flagship product had gone dark. Not slowly, all at once. The predictive engine that 300 client banks depended on simply stopped responding, and the reason it stopped was elegant and merciless. The licensing keys that authenticated the software had been revoked at the source. The code was still there. The servers were still humming. But the heart had been switched off, and only one person in the world had the key to switch it back on. His phone would not stop ringing. Clients, panicked, furious. Hartwell Financial, the very deal that was supposed to close today, calling to ask why their entire trading platform had frozen. Ethan sat in his chair with the phone pressed to his ear, sweating through his expensive shirt, saying the words temporary technical issue. So many times they stopped meaning anything. Temporary! The CEO of Hartwell barked at him. Ethan, my traders are flying blind. I've got positions I can't close. Do you understand what that costs me per minute? Fix it or the deal is dead, and I will tell every person I know why. It'll be back up within the hour, Ethan lied. I promise you, within the hour. It was not back up within the hour. It was not back up within 3 hours. At noon, the board called an emergency meeting. Ethan walked into that boardroom the same way he'd walked into 1,000 rooms before, chin up, shoulders back, wearing confidence like a suit of armor. But the armor didn't fit anymore. He could feel it. The 9 faces around the table weren't looking at him with the old admiration. They were looking at him the way people look at a man standing on a ledge. Ethan, said Harold Pierce, the chairman, an old man with a voice like gravel and eyes that had seen 100 companies rise and fall. Sit down and tell us the truth, all of it. The truth is that we're dealing with a hostile action by a disgruntled contractor, Ethan said, launching into the story he'd been building in his head all morning. Someone with access to our licensing infrastructure has... Stop! Harold raised one hand. Don't. We've all seen the documents, son. The Bennett Trust owns the technology. Your wife owns the technology. She has since before this company went public. He leaned forward. Which raises a question that I think everyone at this table is asking themselves right now. If Claire Bennett owns the intellectual property and Claire Bennett wrote the core algorithms, then what exactly did you build? The room went silent. Ethan opened his mouth. Nothing came out. I'm going to ask you a direct question, Harold went on, and I want you to think very carefully before you lie to me because I have known you for 8 years and I am giving you one chance to be honest. Did you write the technology that this company is built on, yes or no? 12:20 in the afternoon, 9 pairs of eyes on him. And Ethan Caldwell, the visionary, the genius, the man on the magazine covers, opened his mouth to defend the lie he'd lived for a decade. And he couldn't. Not because he suddenly discovered honesty, but because he understood in that instant that every one of them already knew the answer. Lying now wouldn't save him. It would only make him look like exactly what he was. "No," he said finally. The word tasted like ash. "Claire did. But that doesn't matter because we were partners. It was a partnership. She agreed to let me run the company. She agreed to it." "Did she sign anything to that effect?" Harold asked. "Any agreement transferring the technology to you or to the company permanently?" Ethan said nothing. "I'll take that as a no." Harold sat back. "So let me make sure I understand our position. This company's entire value, everything, the products, the client contracts, the valuation, the stock price, all of it rests on technology that is legally owned by a woman who, as of this morning, has revoked our right to use it. And the man we've been paying $7 million a year to lead us didn't write a single line of it and doesn't have a contract securing it." He let out a long breath. "Do I have that right?" "You're making it sound worse than it is," Ethan said desperately. "Son," Harold said, and there was something almost gentle in it now, the gentleness of a man delivering a death sentence. "I don't think it's possible to make it sound worse than it is." The board suspended him that afternoon. Not fired, not yet. The lawyers wanted to move carefully, but suspended, stripped of authority, escorted out of the building he'd walked into as a king that very morning. 12 years he'd spent building that image, and it took less than a day to strip it off him like wet paper. He stood on the sidewalk outside Caldwell Innovations in the cold, holding a cardboard box with his personal effects in it, and he looked up at his name on the top of the tower. Caldwell. Silver letters 40 stories up. And for the first time, he understood that a name on a building doesn't mean you own anything. It just means you paid to have it painted there. He took out his phone and called Claire. It rang 4 times. He was sure she wouldn't answer. And then, on the 5th ring, she did. "Ethan," she said, calm, even, the same voice she'd used to ask about his day. "Claire." His voice cracked on her name. "Claire, please. Whatever you heard, whatever you think you heard, we can talk about this. We can fix this. You're my wife, 12 years. You don't throw away 12 years over one stupid conversation." "You're right," Claire said. "You don't." Hope surged in his chest, wild and stupid. "Which is why," she continued, "I'm not throwing away 12 years over one conversation. I'm ending 12 years because that one conversation finally told me the truth about all of them." A pause. "You called me a burden, Ethan. You said I don't understand the real world. Well, I'm about to give you a very thorough education in exactly how the real world works. Consider it a parting gift." "Claire, don't call me again," she said. "The next voice you hear from my side will be Margaret's." And she hung up. Ethan stood on the sidewalk holding a dead phone in a cardboard box, and something in him that had been standing upright for a very long time finally sat down. 1 o'clock in the afternoon. He had lost his company before lunch and his marriage right after, and he still didn't fully understand that this was only the beginning. That evening, Claire sat alone in her North Side office, the one Ethan had never visited, watching the city lights come on one by one. Margaret sat across from her, having laid out the next 30 days like a general laying out a campaign. "The board's going to try to negotiate," Margaret said. "They'll want to license the technology back from you at a fraction of its value. They'll send lawyers. They'll be charming. Some of them will threaten. What do you want me to tell them?" Claire was quiet for a moment. "Tell them I'm open to a deal," she said. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "You are?" "I am." Claire turned from the window. "But not the deal they're expecting." A small smile touched her lips. "I don't want to license the technology back to them, Margaret. I want to buy the company." Margaret went very still. "Claire, Caldwell Innovations is a public company. Even wounded, even with the stock in free fall, that's a multi-billion-dollar acquisition. You don't have that kind of capital." "No," Claire agreed. "I don't." She sat down across from her old mentor. "But I know someone who does, and I know someone who's been waiting a very long time for a reason to make a move like this." She slid a business card across the desk. Margaret picked it up and read the name, and her eyebrows climbed toward her hairline. "Alexander Whitmore." She looked up. "The Whitmore of Whitmore Capital." "We were at MIT together," Claire said. He was 2 years ahead of me, brilliant, ruthless, and the only man in that entire program who ever treated me like the smartest person in the room instead of the prettiest woman in it. She paused. We kept in touch, loosely, Christmas cards, the occasional email, and about a year ago over dinner, he told me something I've thought about a great deal since. What did he tell you? He told me, Claire said slowly, that he'd been watching Caldwell Innovations for years, that he'd always suspected the technology was too good for a man like Ethan to have built, and that if I ever, and I quote, got tired of watching my husband take credit for my work, I should call him, because he'd back me against Ethan Caldwell any day of the week and twice on Sunday. Margaret set the card down. And are you tired of it? Claire looked at her, and there was nothing soft left in her eyes at all. I stopped being tired of it the moment I stopped being married to it, she said. Now I'm just finishing it. 2 days later, Alexander Whitmore flew into Chicago. Claire hadn't seen him in 3 years, but he was exactly as she remembered, tall, silver at the temples, now with the still watchful calm of a man who had made more money than most nations and never once raised his voice to do it. He walked into her small 2-room office, looked around at it, and smiled. So this is the war room, he said. I expected something grander. I've found, Claire said, that the grander the office, the smaller the person usually is. Alexander laughed a real laugh, warm and surprised. God, I've missed you, Claire. Do you know how rare it is to have a conversation with someone who actually thinks? He sat down across from her. All right, Margaret sent me the outline. I've read it 4 times. And I'm going to be honest with you because you've always deserved honesty, and I suspect you've been starved of it. This is one of the cleanest acquisition setups I've ever seen. The company's crown jewels are already yours. The stock is collapsing. The board is terrified. The CEO is disgraced and suspended. He leaned forward. You've essentially cut the legs off a giant, and now you just need someone to help you buy it while it's on the ground. And you want that someone to be me. I do, Claire said. Why me? You could have your pick of investors. Because Claire said the others would want to buy Ethan's company. You're the only one who understands that there's no such thing. There's only my company that Ethan happened to be standing in front of for 12 years. She met his eyes. I don't want a rescuer, Alexander. I've had enough of men who want to save me. I want a partner who wants to win with me. There's a difference, and you're one of the few people alive who knows it. Alexander was quiet for a long moment. Then he extended his hand across the desk. Then let's take it back, he said. All of it. And let's make sure the whole world knows whose name should have been on that building the entire time. Claire shook his hand. And that handshake, quiet in a 2-room office on the north side of Chicago, was the beginning of the end for Ethan Caldwell. He just didn't know it yet. But Ethan, disgraced as he was not finished. Not in his own mind. A man like Ethan does not accept that he's beaten. He looks for an angle. And within a week, wounded and desperate and drowning in lawsuits, he found one, or thought he did. He found an investor of his own. The message came through a mutual contact, a whisper at first, then a phone call. A private equity group, the message said, was interested in taking a position in Caldwell Innovations. They saw value where others saw only wreckage. They believed the company could be saved. And they wanted to meet with Ethan directly before the board to structure a rescue that would put him back in control. Ethan wept when he heard it. Actual tears alone in the study of a mansion that was about to be part of a divorce settlement. Someone still believed in him. Someone still saw the genius. He would come back. He would come back, and he would look Claire in the eye and show her exactly who she'd underestimated. He didn't ask enough questions. Of course he didn't. He never did. He didn't ask why a savvy private equity group would want to rescue a company whose core technology was owned by his estranged wife. He didn't ask who was really behind the fund. He heard the words control and rescue and back on top, and his ego did the rest. The meeting was set for the following Thursday. Ethan spent 3 days preparing, rehearsing, buying a new suit. He walked into the private dining room of a downtown hotel that afternoon with his old swagger halfway restored, ready to charm his way back to the throne. And there at the head of the table, sitting perfectly still with his hands folded, was a man Ethan had never met but had certainly heard of. Alexander Whitmore. Mr. Caldwell, Alexander said pleasantly. Please, sit. We have a great deal to discuss." Ethan didn't recognize the name's connection to Claire. Why would he? He'd never once bothered to learn about the people in his wife's life. To him, Alexander Whitmore was simply a legendary investor, a whale, the answer to his prayers. He sat down and he smiled, and he had absolutely no idea he'd just walked into the jaws of the trap that would finish him. "I have to say," Ethan began sliding into his pitch, "your timing is remarkable. This company has been through a rough patch, but the fundamentals are sound. The technology is world-class. With the right capital behind me, I can have us back on top within—" "Mr. Caldwell?" Alexander held up a hand gently. "Let me stop you there. I'm going to save us both some time because I respect efficiency even when I don't respect much else about a situation." He slid a document across the table. "Here's my offer. It's generous, perhaps more generous than you deserve. I'll inject the capital needed to stabilize the company and cover your immediate legal exposure. In exchange, I take a controlling interest contingent on one simple condition." Ethan's eyes were already lighting up. Capital, stabilization, rescue. "What condition?" "That you can prove ownership of the core technology," Alexander said smoothly. "It's a formality, of course. You're the founder, the CEO. Naturally, the technology is yours. Just sign here, initial there, and if you can demonstrate clear title to the intellectual property, within 30 days, control transfers, the capital flows, and you're saved." He smiled. "If for some reason you can't, then the controlling interest simply converts to me and I sort out the ownership situation myself. But that won't happen, will it, Mr. Caldwell? You built this company. Of course you own the technology." It was the same trap, the exact same trap. The details were right there on the page, the poison written in plain black ink for anyone who bothered to read it. If Ethan failed to prove ownership, and he could not prove ownership, he had never owned it, then everything transferred to Alexander. It wasn't a rescue. It was a takeover dressed up as a lifeline, and the bait was Ethan's own desperation to be saved. And Ethan Caldwell, who never read the details, who had learned nothing, absolutely nothing, from the folder that had already destroyed his life, looked at Alexander Whitmore's confident smile, heard the words, "You built this company," and felt his wounded ego swell up one last time to swallow him whole. "Where do I sign?" he said. Alexander handed him the pen. 2:40 in the afternoon. Ethan Caldwell signed his own name across the bottom of the document that would strip him of the last thing he had left, and he did it beaming, believing he'd just been rescued, never once suspecting that the man across the table had learned every detail of this deal from a woman in a 2-room office who knew exactly how Ethan would react when someone offered to save him. Alexander took the signed document, glanced at it, and slid it into a leather folder. "Wonderful," he said. "You've made an excellent decision, Mr. Caldwell. I think this partnership is going to be everything you deserve." The words had a strange weight to them that Ethan, glowing with relief, didn't feel. "You won't regret this," Ethan said, pumping his hand. "I promise you, we're going to do great things together." "I have no doubt," Alexander said, "that this is going to work out exactly the way it should." And he smiled a smile that Ethan mistook for warmth. That night, for the first time in a week, Ethan slept soundly. He dreamed of walking back into the boardroom with Alexander Whitmore at his back and watching Harold Pierce's face fall. He dreamed of Claire seeing his name back on top of the tower and finally understanding what she'd thrown away. He dreamed of winning. Across the city, Claire sat with Alexander in her office, the signed document on the desk between them, and she did not smile. She looked at Ethan's signature for a long time. "He didn't read it," she said quietly. "He actually didn't read it, even now, even after everything." She shook her head slowly. "Part of me hoped he would. Part of me hoped that losing everything might have taught him to at least look at what he's signing." "Some men never learn," Alexander said. "Their arrogance isn't a habit, Claire. It's who they are. You can't teach a man like Ethan to be careful any more than you can teach a fish to climb. He was always going to sign it. You knew that. It's why the plan works." "I know," Claire said. "It's just strange to be proven right about someone you used to love." She touched the edge of the document. "In 30 days, when he can't prove ownership, control transfers to you, and then you and I complete the acquisition, and Caldwell Innovations becomes ours. His name comes off the building. The whole thing ends." "That's the plan," Alexander said. He studied her. "You don't look as happy as I expected." "I'm not doing this to be happy," Claire said. "I'm doing this because it's right. There's a difference." She looked up at him. He spent 12 years standing on my work and calling it his own. He looked me in the eye across a dinner table and told me there was honor in being simple. He deserves to lose the thing he stole. "That's not happiness, Alexander. That's just balance." Alexander nodded slowly. "You know," he said, "there's still one piece of this you haven't told me about. Olivia, the assistant." Claire's expression didn't change. "What about her?" "I did some digging the way I do." Alexander leaned back. "Olivia Harper isn't an assistant. She never was. She's an investigative financial analyst working with a firm that specializes in corporate fraud. She's been embedded in Caldwell Innovations for 8 months. He watched Claire's face. She wasn't there for Ethan's charm, Claire. She was there building a case against him. Financial crimes, misrepresentation to investors, fraud that goes back years. A pause. The affair Ethan risked his marriage for. It was never real. She was working him the entire time, using his ego to get access to documents he never should have shown her. For a moment, Claire was quiet. Then softly she began to laugh. Not cruelly, just tiredly at the sheer poetry of it. "So the woman he threw away his marriage for," she said, "was never even interested in him." "She was interested in putting him in prison," Alexander said, "and from what I've seen of her file, she's very good at her job." Claire shook her head slowly, and something in her chest loosened some last knot of pain she hadn't even known was still tied. Ethan had betrayed her, had humiliated her, had called her a burden and a fool, and he'd done all of it for a woman who was using him as bait in a trap of her own. He'd burned down his life for a mirage. He'd been played by everyone at that table, including himself, and he was the only one who couldn't see it. "He lost his company to me," Claire said quietly. "He lost his marriage because of her, and he's going to lose his freedom to a woman he thought was falling in love with him." She sat back. "And through all of it, right up to this very moment, he still thinks he's the smartest man in the room." 3 months earlier, she'd been a woman standing outside a door with a cold lunch in her hands, listening to her husband laugh at her. Now she sat at the center of a web that ran through boardrooms and law offices, and Wall Street holding every thread, and every thread led back to a man who still believed she was simple. "Alexander," she said, "when the 30 days are up, when control transfers, I want to be in the room." "Of course," he said. "Any particular reason?" Claire looked out at the city lights at the tower with her stolen name on top of it glowing against the dark. "Because for 12 years, she said, I stood behind him and watched him take the credit. Just once, I want him to have to look at me while I take it back." Alexander smiled, and this time there was real admiration in it. "You know," he said, "your husband spent his whole career telling people you didn't understand the real world." "I know," Claire said. "He was wrong," Alexander said. "You're the only person I've ever met who understands it completely." Claire didn't answer. She just watched the lights of the city calm as still water and waited for the 30 days to pass. And 30 stories up across town, Ethan Caldwell slept peacefully in his soon-to-be former mansion, dreaming of a comeback that was never going to happen, having signed his own destruction with a smile and a borrowed pen, still utterly convinced even now, even at the very edge of the cliff, that he was the one holding all the cards. The countdown had begun, and there was nothing left for him to sign his way out of. The 30 days did not pass quietly. They passed like a fuse burning towards something Ethan couldn't see, and he spent every one of them convinced he was winning. He threw himself into the illusion of a comeback. He rented a small office downtown, hired 2 loyal assistants who hadn't yet heard how far he'd fallen, and began making calls. He told everyone the same story. Alexander Whitmore was backing him. Whitmore Capital was going to stabilize the company force out the board and put Ethan back at the top. He said it so many times that he stopped hearing how desperate it sounded. He said it to old colleagues who stopped returning his calls. He said it to reporters who wrote it down with careful, pitying expressions. He said it to himself in the mirror every morning while he knotted his tie. What he did not do, not once in those 30 days, was try to prove that he owned the technology, because deep down in the place where a man keeps the truths, he can't stand to look at Ethan, knew he couldn't. He knew there was no document, no patent, no line of code with his name on it. He knew Claire had built it all. But he told himself it didn't matter. He told himself Alexander would handle it. He told himself that when the time came, the paperwork would somehow sort itself out because it always had before. Someone else had always cleaned up his messes. For 12 years that someone had been Claire. 10 days into the countdown, the divorce papers arrived. Margaret Cole delivered them personally, which was itself a message. She walked into Ethan's rented office, set the folder on his desk, and stood with her hands folded while he read. He read the terms, and his face went white, then red, then something worse. Claire wasn't asking for half of everything the way a scorned wife might. She was asking for something far more devastating. She was asking for nothing. No alimony, no share of the mansion, no claim on any of Ethan's personal assets. The papers were almost insultingly clean. "I don't understand," Ethan said, looking up. "She's not asking for anything. Why isn't she asking for anything?" Margaret regarded him with something close to contempt. "Because she doesn't want anything of yours, Mr. Caldwell," she said. "That's the point. She's not taking your money. She never needed your money. Everything of value that this marriage ever produced, she built herself. You have nothing she wants." A pause. It must be strange to finally offer a woman everything and discover she considers all of it worthless. Ethan stared at the papers, and for the first time, the reality of what he'd lost began to take a shape he could actually feel. It wasn't the company. It wasn't even the humiliation. It was this, that Claire could walk away from 12 years and take nothing because to her, he had never been worth anything at all. The whole time he'd been congratulating himself on marrying up, she'd been the one settling. "I want to see her," he said suddenly, "face to face, just once. You owe me that much." "I don't owe you anything," Margaret said, "but I'll pass along the request." She turned to leave, then stopped at the door. "For what it's worth, Mr. Caldwell, and it isn't worth much, she did love you once. Genuinely. I watched it. That woman would have walked through fire for you." She opened the door. "You didn't lose her when you cheated. You lost her the moment she realized you'd never once seen her at all." And she left. 11 o'clock in the morning, day 10. Ethan sat alone with the divorce papers and the terrible dawning understanding that the person he'd spent his life underestimating had understood him perfectly the entire time. Meanwhile, Olivia Harper was still inside Caldwell Innovations, and she was almost finished. For 8 months, she had played her part flawlessly, the admiring assistant, the young woman who laughed at his jokes and hung on his every word and made him feel like the genius he pretended to be. She'd done it because it worked, because a man drunk on his own reflection will show you anything if you tell him he's brilliant while he does it. Ethan had given her access to files a CEO should never share with an assistant. Financial records, investor communications, internal memos where the numbers didn't match the story he'd told the market. He'd handed her the rope to hang him with, and he'd done it grinning because she'd told him he was handsome while she asked for it. Now she sat in a nondescript office across the river in front of 2 federal investigators and a lawyer from the Securities and Exchange Commission laying it all out. He inflated the company's growth projections for 3 consecutive years, she said, sliding documents across the table. Told investors the predictive engine was proprietary technology developed in-house wholly owned by the company. He knew that wasn't true. He knew it was licensed from an outside trust. He misrepresented material facts to raise capital. That's securities fraud. And this, she tapped another folder, is the part that's going to end him. He personally signed off on financials that he knew were false. His signature, every quarter. The lead investigator flipped through the pages slowly. "You've been thorough, Ms. Harper." "That's the job," Olivia said. "People think investigating fraud is about numbers. It's not. It's about ego. You find the man who's certain he's smarter than everyone else, and you let him prove it to you. He'll do the rest himself." She closed the last folder. "Ethan Caldwell hanged himself. I just held the rope steady." The investigator looked up. "You understand that once we move on this, it becomes very public, very fast." "I'm counting on it," Olivia said. 2 weeks into the countdown, Ethan got his meeting with Claire. She agreed to it against Margaret's advice, agreed to it for reasons even she couldn't entirely explain. Maybe she wanted to see if there was anything left of the man she'd married. Maybe she wanted to be certain once and for all that walking away was right. Or maybe she just wanted to look him in the eye one time, as herself, not as the wife standing quietly behind him. They met in a quiet corner of a hotel lounge downtown, neutral ground. Claire arrived first and was already seated when Ethan walked in, and the moment he saw her, he stopped short. Because she looked different, not physically. She wore the same kind of simple clothes she always had. But something about the way she sat, the stillness of her, the calm in her eyes made her look like a woman he'd never met. "Claire," he said, sitting down across from her. "Thank you for seeing me. You look good." "You look tired, Ethan," she said, not unkindly, just honestly. He laughed a hollow sound. "Yeah, well, it's been a rough few weeks, but I want you to know that's about to change. Alexander Whitmore is backing me. Big investment. I'm going to be back on top before you know it, and I want you to be part of that. Claire, I know I messed up. I know I hurt you, but we can start over. We can—" "Ethan." Claire's voice was gentle, and it stopped him cold. "Do you know who Alexander Whitmore is?" Ethan blinked. "He's an investor, a legend. He's saving my company." "He's an old friend of mine," Claire said, "from MIT. He was 2 years ahead of me." She watched the confusion dawn on his face. "He's not saving your company, Ethan. He's helping me buy it." The color drained out of Ethan's face for the second time in a month. "What?" "The deal you signed," Claire went on, still gentle, which somehow made it worse. "The one you were so relieved to sign. Did you read it? Did you read any of it? It was a rescue deal, capital in exchange for a controlling interest contingent on—" He stopped. His mouth went dry. "Contingent on proving I own the technology." "Which you don't," Claire said softly. "Which you've never owned. So in 16 days, when you can't prove it, control of Caldwell Innovations transfers to Alexander. And then he and I complete the acquisition. And your company becomes mine." She paused. "It was always mine, Ethan. I'm just taking it out of your hands." Ethan sat frozen, the full architecture of the trap assembling itself in his mind, piece by devastating piece. The affair that gutted his marriage, the revoked licenses that killed his product, the board that suspended him, the investor who wasn't a rescuer but an executioner. And behind all of it, holding every string, the quiet woman he'd called simple across a dinner table 2 weeks before his world ended. "You planned all of this," he whispered. "No," Claire said. "You did all of this. Every single piece. I just stopped cleaning up after you." She leaned forward slightly. "You want to know the truth, Ethan? I wasn't planning anything the day I brought you lunch. I was planning to surprise you for our anniversary. I had a watch in my bag. I'd had it engraved. For the man who taught me to dream bigger." Something flickered across her face, gone as fast as it came. "And then I heard you tell another woman that I was simple, that I didn't understand the real world, and I realized the man I was bringing lunch to didn't exist. He never had. I'd invented him." She sat back. "So no, Ethan, I didn't plan this. You just finally showed me who you were, and I stopped pretending I didn't see it." Ethan's hands were shaking. "Claire, please, I'm begging you. I have nothing left. The company, the board, the divorce, and now you're telling me Whitmore is that this whole thing was—" His voice broke. "You're going to take everything." "I'm taking back what was always mine," Claire corrected. "There's a difference, and you'd understand it if you'd ever bothered to understand anything about me at all." She stood. "Wait," Ethan said desperately. "Claire, wait. What about Olivia? She cares about me. She's the only one who—" And Claire stopped. She looked at him, and for a moment there was something almost like pity in her eyes. "Oh, Ethan," she said quietly, "you still don't know, do you?" "Know what?" "Olivia Harper isn't your assistant," Claire said. "She never was. She's a financial fraud investigator. She's been building a case against you for 8 months. The affair, the flattery, the access you gave her, all of it was work. She was gathering evidence." Claire's voice was soft, almost merciful. "The woman you threw away our marriage for was never interested in you. She was interested in putting you in prison, and from what I understand, she's very close to succeeding." The silence that followed was absolute. Ethan looked like a man who'd been struck. His mouth opened and closed. He gripped the edge of the table as if the floor had tilted beneath him. "That's not," he managed. "That's not true. She was doing her job," Claire said. "And you made it easy because you'll believe anything a person tells you as long as they tell you you're brilliant while they say it. That was always your weakness, Ethan. Not that you weren't smart, but that you needed so badly to be told you were that anyone could lead you anywhere just by flattering you there." She picked up her bag. "It's how Olivia got her evidence. It's how Alexander got your signature. And it's how you lost me 12 years before you ever noticed I was gone." She turned to leave. "Claire." His voice was barely a whisper now. "I loved you. In my own way. I did." She paused. She didn't turn around. "I know you think that," she said. "But you didn't love me, Ethan. You loved what I did for you. You loved that I made your life easy and asked for nothing and never made you feel small. That's not love. That's convenience." She glanced back over her shoulder one last time. "Love is when someone sees all of who you are and chooses you anyway. You never once saw who I was, so there was never anything for you to love." And she walked out, leaving him alone in the lounge with a cold cup of coffee and the wreckage of a life he'd built on a lie. 2:40 in the afternoon. That was the moment Ethan Caldwell finally understood the size of what he'd lost. And it was so much larger than a company. The days after that meeting blurred together for Ethan into a kind of slow-motion drowning. He tried to fight. Of course he tried. Desperation makes men do frantic things. He hired a new legal team, an expensive one, and instructed them to challenge the licensing revocation, to challenge the Whitmore deal, to challenge the divorce, to challenge everything. But there was nothing to challenge. The documents were airtight. Margaret Cole had spent 12 years quietly making sure of it. Every path Ethan's lawyers explored ended at the same wall. Claire owned the technology. Claire had always owned the technology, and Ethan had signed away his last leverage the moment he put his name on Alexander's deal without reading it. "There's no case here, Mr. Caldwell," his lead attorney told him finally, 3 days before the countdown ended. "I'm sorry. Whoever set this up did it flawlessly. The trust structure, the licensing terms, the acquisition mechanism, it's all legal. It's all clean. And it's all pointing one direction. Frankly, in 20 years of practice, I've never seen anything this precise." He hesitated. "Whoever your wife hired to build this, they're the best I've ever seen." "She didn't hire someone to build it," Ethan said dully, staring at the wall. "She built it herself, years ago, and I never even knew." The lawyer didn't have anything to say to that. Then 2 days before Control was set to transfer, the second blow landed. It came in the form of federal agents. They arrived at Ethan's rented office in the morning, calm and professional, with a warrant and a list of charges that Olivia Harper had spent 8 months assembling. Securities fraud, wire fraud, making false statements to investors, falsifying financial records. The charges stacked up like bricks, each one supported by documents bearing Ethan's own signature documents he'd handed to a smiling young woman he'd believed was falling in love with him. They didn't arrest him that morning. White-collar cases move differently. But they served him and they seized records and they made it clear that this was only the beginning. And as the agents worked, Ethan sat in the corner of his own office and watched his last illusion crumble. Because here was the final, unbearable truth of it. Even his affair, the one selfish, reckless thing he'd done purely for himself, hadn't been real. Olivia had never wanted him. She'd never laughed at his jokes because they were funny or admired his mind because it impressed her. Every warm look, every intimate laugh, every moment that had made him feel young and powerful and seen all of it had been a performance designed to lead him to exactly this. He'd betrayed his marriage, humiliated his wife, and gambled his integrity for a woman who'd been building his prison the entire time. He'd thrown away the one person who genuinely loved him for the illusion of being wanted by someone who was using him. And he'd done it all himself. That was the part that would never stop echoing. Claire hadn't destroyed him. Alexander hadn't destroyed him. Olivia hadn't destroyed him. They'd simply stood back and let him destroy himself because his arrogance was a weapon that only ever pointed in one direction. 10 in the morning, 2 days before the end. The federal agents packed up their boxes and left, and Ethan sat alone in the silence, and for the first time in his adult life, he had no story to tell himself, no comeback to plan, no flattery to believe, just the plain, unbearable fact of who he was and what he'd done. The night before control was set to transfer, Ethan did something he hadn't done in years. He drove out to the old neighborhood, to the street where he and Claire had lived when they were young in the apartment with the broken heater and the mattress on the floor. The building was still there, older now. He parked across from it and looked up at the window that had once been theirs, and he remembered. He remembered Claire in fingerless gloves typing through the cold, laughing when he brought her cheap coffee. He remembered her explaining her code to him late at night, her eyes bright with a brilliance he'd been too self-absorbed to truly see. He remembered her saying, "We're going to build something, Ethan, and I don't care if the whole world knows my name as long as we build it together." "We built it together," she'd said. And he'd taken the together and thrown it away one careless choice at a time until there was nothing left but him, alone in a car looking up at a window that belonged to strangers now. He thought about calling her. He even took out his phone, but he remembered what she'd said. "Don't call me again. The next voice you hear from my side will be Margaret's." He put the phone away. Some doors, once they close, don't open again. Ethan had spent his whole life not reading the fine print, but he understood this much finally sitting in the dark outside the home of his younger, better self. He'd left a door open once, in an office on an ordinary afternoon, and through that open door the woman he'd underestimated had heard exactly who he was. Everything that followed had simply been the consequence of being known. The morning the countdown ended, Claire arrived at the offices of Caldwell Innovations at 9 o'clock sharp. She walked through the glass lobby where the receptionist had once smiled at her curiously, and this time the young woman's eyes went wide with something like awe. Word had traveled. Everyone knew now. The quiet wife had been the architect all along. Claire rode the elevator up to the executive floor. Alexander was waiting for her, along with Margaret and the full board of directors. Harold Pierce rose when she entered, and to Claire's quiet astonishment, the old man inclined his head with genuine respect. "Ms. Bennett," he said, "on behalf of the board, I want to say we owe you an apology that's 12 years overdue. We spent all that time celebrating the wrong person. That ends today." "Thank you, Harold," Claire said, "but I'm not here for an apology. I'm here to finish something." At exactly 9:30, the 30-day deadline expired. Ethan Caldwell had failed to prove ownership of the technology because there had never been any ownership to prove. And in a conference room high above the city, with lawyers and board members as witnesses, control of Caldwell Innovations transferred to Alexander Whitmore, and from Alexander through the deal he and Claire had structured weeks before to the Bennett Trust. The company was hers, fully, completely, legally. The empire Ethan had claimed to build now belonged to the woman he'd called Simple, and Ethan was not there to see it. He hadn't been invited, and even if he had been, he wouldn't have come. He was at home in a mansion that no longer felt like his, watching the news break on television. Caldwell Innovations under new ownership. Founder Ethan Caldwell removed amid fraud investigation. Technology revealed to have been developed by Claire Bennett, ex-wife of the disgraced CEO. He watched his own downfall play out on the screen, and he felt strangely numb. There was nothing left to feel. He'd lost the company. He'd lost the marriage. He was about to lose his freedom, and the woman who now held everything he'd ever claimed as his own had done it without ever once raising her voice. That afternoon, Claire stood in Ethan's old office. Her office now. She walked to the window and looked out over the city, and Alexander came and stood beside her. "How does it feel?" he asked quietly. Claire considered the question honestly. "Lighter than I expected," she said. "And heavier, too." She was quiet for a moment. "I keep thinking about the girl I used to be, the one who built all this in a freezing apartment because she believed in a boy who told her they'd do it together." She turned from the window. "I'm glad she finally gets to see her name on the work. I just wish she hadn't had to lose so much to get here." "She didn't lose," Alexander said. "She was robbed. There's a difference. And today she took it back." He paused. "What happens now to Ethan?" Claire looked back out at the city, at the tower she now owned, at the name Caldwell still blazing in silver at the top of it. "That's up to the courts now," she said, "and to Olivia. His crimes were his own. His choices were his own. I'm not going to save him, and I'm not going to sink him. I'm just done carrying him." She was silent for a long moment. "The first thing I'm going to do," she said finally, "is take his name off the building." And 2 days later she did. The workers came in the early morning and took down the silver letters one by one, and Claire stood on the sidewalk below and watched them come down the same sidewalk where Ethan had stood a month earlier, holding a cardboard box, looking up at a name he thought meant he owned something. CALDWELL came down letter by letter, and in its place, by that afternoon, rose a new name in clean, simple letters that caught the light. BENNETT. Claire Bennett stood on the sidewalk and looked up at her own name on her own building above her own company, and for the first time in 15 years, she saw the truth written plainly for the whole world to read. She hadn't been the woman behind the man. She'd been the foundation the whole time. And now, at last, everyone could see it. The letters were barely up on the building before the vultures began to circle, and the first of them wore a federal badge. Word of the ownership transfer had traveled fast, but the fraud investigation traveled faster. Olivia Harper's 8 months of quiet work had built a case that didn't need Claire's cooperation to move forward, and once Ethan lost the company, the last thing shielding him vanished with it. A disgraced CEO with no board behind him and no lawyers on retainer is a very different target than a billionaire at the top of the world. The prosecutors who had been building slowly carefully now had no reason to wait. 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Claire's name went up on the tower, the story broke. Federal prosecutors announced a formal indictment of Ethan Caldwell, securities fraud, wire fraud, making false statements to investors, falsifying corporate financial records. The charges filled 2 pages, and every one of them was supported by documents bearing Ethan's own signature documents he had handed, smiling to a young woman he'd believed was falling in love with him. Claire learned about it the way the rest of the country did, on the news. She was in her office now in the building that carried her name, when the alert came across her screen. She read it twice, and then she set the phone down and looked out the window for a long time, feeling something she hadn't expected to feel. Not triumph. Not satisfaction, just a heavy, quiet sorrow, the kind that settles over you when something you once loved finally reaches the end you always knew was coming. Margaret Cole came into the office an hour later, having heard the news herself. "It's official," she said, sitting down across from Claire. "They've indicted him. The trial will be a circus. The press is already calling it the fall of the golden boy." She studied Claire's face. "You don't look happy." "Should I be?" Claire asked. "A lot of women in your position would be." "I'm not a lot of women," Claire said quietly. "I loved him, Margaret. Not the man he became, the man he used to be, the one who slept next to me in a freezing apartment and told me we were going to build something together." She shook her head. "I don't feel happy watching him fall. I just feel tired. And a little bit like I'm watching a funeral for someone who died a long time ago and only just now stopped breathing." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that surprised Claire. "You know they're going to want you to testify." Claire looked up. "Testify?" "You're the central witness," Margaret said. "You built the technology he claimed was his. You own the trust. Your testimony is the difference between a conviction and an acquittal." She paused. "And I'll be honest with you, Claire, because you've always deserved honesty. I don't think you should do it. You've won. You have the company, the name, your freedom. Let the prosecutors handle Ethan. You don't owe anyone a performance in a courtroom. Walk away clean." Claire considered it, and for a few days she thought she might. She told the prosecutors no when they first approached her. She had what she wanted. Ethan's crimes were his own to answer for, and she felt no hunger to stand up in public and twist the knife. But then the prosecutors showed her something that changed her mind. They met in a conference room downtown, and the lead prosecutor, a sharp, quiet woman named Diane Alvarez, slid a document across the table. "This is a copy of Mr. Caldwell's proposed defense strategy," she said. "We obtained it through discovery. I think you should read it before you decide." Claire read it. And as she read, something cold began to spread through her chest. Ethan's defense wasn't going to be that he was innocent. It couldn't be. The documents were too damning. His defense was going to be that he was too foolish to have committed a crime, that he had genuinely honestly believed that technology was his, that any misrepresentation to investors had been an innocent mistake made by a man who trusted the people around him. And the person he intended to blame for that confusion, the person his lawyers planned to say had deceived him about who really owned the technology, was Claire. "He's going to testify that you kept him in the dark," Diane said quietly, watching Claire's face. "That you deliberately hid the ownership structure from him, that you, his own wife, set him up to fail. He's going to make himself the victim, Ms. Bennett, and he's going to make you the villain who manipulated a trusting husband into signing documents he didn't understand." She paused. "And I have to be honest with you. Without your testimony, a jury might believe him. He's charming. It's the one real talent he has. He can walk into a room of strangers and make them love him. If you're not there to counter it, he could walk." Claire sat very still. For 12 years she had let Ethan take credit for her work. She had stood in the shadows and said nothing while he claimed her genius as his own, and now at the very end, cornered and desperate, his final move was to reach for her one last time, not to hold her, but to hide behind her. He wanted to take the blame for his crimes and hang it around her neck, the same way he'd taken the credit for her brilliance and pinned it to his own chest. He wanted to make her responsible for his failures the way he'd made himself responsible for her successes. Something in Claire hardened. "He wants to blame me," she said slowly. "Yes. For crimes he committed. He wants to stand up in front of a jury and say that his simple, foolish wife tricked him." Claire's voice was very quiet, but there was steel running through it now. "He spent 12 years telling the world I didn't understand the real world. And now he wants to tell them I understood it well enough to deceive him. He can't even keep his own lies straight." She looked up at Diane. "I'll testify." 9 o'clock the first morning of the trial, 4 months later. Claire walked into the courtroom in a plain gray suit, and the room turned to look at her, the way rooms had turned to look at her for a year now, with something that had shifted from curiosity to awe. Ethan was already seated at the defense table. When he saw her, his face did something complicated, hope and shame and a desperate drowning wish all crossing it at once. He looked terrible. That was Claire's first thought. Thinner, grayer. The polish that had always made him gleam was gone, and underneath it was just a frightened man in a suit that no longer fit right. For a moment, against all reason, her heart ached for him. Then she remembered the defense document, remembered that even now, even destroyed his instinct, was to reach for her as a shield, and the ache hardened back into resolve. She took her seat. She folded her hands. She did not look at him again. The prosecution built its case with methodical precision over the following days. But it was Olivia Harper's testimony that first cracked the courtroom open. She took the stand on the third day and spoke for 6 hours, walking the jury through 8 months of evidence document by document, lie by lie. She was extraordinary on the stand, calm and exact and utterly unshakable. And when Ethan's lawyers tried to paint her as a scorned mistress with a vendetta, she looked at them with something close to pity. "I have no vendetta against Mr. Caldwell," she said evenly. "That would require me to have had feelings for him, and I never did. He knew a character I was playing. I knew a subject I was investigating. There's nothing personal in it." She turned slightly toward the jury. "People assume that investigating a man requires hating him. It doesn't. It just requires patience and access. Mr. Caldwell gave me both. He showed me documents no assistant should ever see because I told him he was brilliant while I asked to see them, and a man who needs to be told he's brilliant will show you anything." She paused. "I didn't trap him. I just held the door open and let his own ego walk him through it." Ethan sat through her testimony with his jaw clenched so tight the muscle jumped in his cheek. And Claire, watching from the gallery, saw the exact moment his last illusion died. It was there, in the slow collapse of his shoulders, the way something went out of his eyes when Olivia said the words, "I never had feelings for him." Whatever fantasy Ethan had been clinging to, that somewhere in the wreckage, there had been at least one real thing, one genuine connection worth all he'd thrown away, died right there in front of a jury and a room full of reporters. He'd burned down his marriage for a woman who'd never felt a single thing for him, and he was only now in a courtroom finding out. On the 5th day they called Claire. She rose, walked to the stand, placed her hand on the book, and swore to tell the truth. And then she sat, and she looked out at the courtroom, and for the first time in 15 years, Claire Bennett told her whole story in her own voice to a room full of people who had no choice but to listen. "Ms. Bennett," Diane began, "can you describe your role in the founding of the company that became Caldwell Innovations?" "I built it," Claire said simply. "The technology, I mean. The predictive engine the entire company was based on. I designed the core algorithms. I wrote the foundational code. I solved the problems that made the whole thing possible." She paused. "I did that work between 2009 and 2012, mostly at night, in a small apartment my husband and I shared. He handled the business side, the meetings, the fundraising, the public face. I handled the substance." "And whose name was on the company publicly?" "His," Claire said. "We agreed to that. At the time, I believed it was practical. Investors wanted one charismatic founder they could picture, and Ethan was good at being that. I wasn't interested in the spotlight, so we agreed he'd be the face, and I'd be the engine." A pause. "I thought we were partners. I thought it didn't matter whose name was on the door, as long as we both knew the truth of who did what." "But you protected the technology legally, in your own name." "I did," Claire said. "Before the company went public on the advice of my attorney, I placed the core intellectual property into a private trust I controlled. The company had the right to license it. It never owned it." She looked down at her hands. "I want to be honest about why. It wasn't because I distrusted Ethan. I loved him completely, but my attorney gave me advice I never forgot. She told me to never hand a man the only thing that was truly mine, to protect myself in case a day ever came when I'd need protection." Claire looked up. "I prayed that day would never come. For 12 years it didn't. And then—" The courtroom was silent. Ethan stared at the table in front of him. "And then," Claire said, her voice steady, "on the afternoon of our 12th anniversary, I brought my husband lunch at his office to surprise him. And through a door he'd left open, I overheard him tell another woman that I was simple, that I didn't understand the real world, that I was, and I'm quoting him exactly, just comfortable being his wife." She paused. "And I heard him say he had built the company, that he was the genius behind all of it." Another pause. "And in that moment, I understood that the man I'd spent 12 years believing in had never once seen me. He'd taken my work, my love, and my silence, and convinced himself he'd done it all alone." "Objection!" Ethan's lawyer was on his feet. "Relevance. This is a fraud trial, not a divorce proceeding." "It goes directly to Mr. Caldwell's state of mind and his established pattern of claiming credit for work he did not perform," Diane replied. "It speaks to whether his misrepresentations were innocent mistakes or deliberate deceptions." "Overruled. The witness may continue," Claire continued, and now she looked directly at Ethan for the first time since taking the stand. "The defense is going to tell you," she said, "that Ethan didn't know the technology wasn't his, that he was confused, that I deceived him about who owned it." Her voice stayed calm, but the steel beneath it was unmistakable now. "I need to be very clear because it matters. Ethan Caldwell knew exactly who built that technology. He knew because he watched me build it. He knew because for years, whenever a technical crisis threatened the company, he came to me in private to solve it and then presented the solution to the public as his own. He knew because he personally signed licensing agreements every single quarter, paying my trust for the right to use my work." She paused. "He didn't misunderstand who owned the technology. He simply never imagined he'd be held accountable for the gap between the truth and the story he told. Because for 12 years I let him get away with it." Ethan's head came up. His eyes were wet. "He is not a confused man," Claire said quietly, holding his gaze. "He is a man who spent his whole life being told he was brilliant, and who never once had to face what happened when the person actually doing the work stopped covering for him. That's not a defense. That's a confession." The courtroom was so silent Claire could hear the court reporter's fingers on the keys. Diane let the moment breathe. Then softly she asked her final question. "Ms. Bennett, after all of it, the affair, the fraud, this attempt to blame you for his own crimes, do you hate your ex-husband?" Claire was quiet for a long moment. She looked at Ethan, and the steel in her face softened into something that was almost tenderness, almost grief. "No," she said. "I don't hate him. You can't hate someone you finally see clearly. Hatred needs a kind of hope, I think. The hope that the person might have been different than they were. I don't have that hope anymore." She folded her hands. "I feel sorry for him. He had everything. A woman who loved him, a company built on real genius, a life most people would give anything for. And he threw it all away, not because he was evil, but because he could never stop needing to believe he was the smartest man in every room." She looked at the jury. "That's what destroyed him. Not me, not Miss Harper, not the investors. His own need to be worshipped. We simply stopped worshiping him, and it turned out that was the only thing holding him up." "No further questions?" Diane said. 2:17 in the afternoon, day 5. That was the moment the trial ended in every way that mattered. Everything after it was procedure. The cross-examination was brief and disastrous for the defense. Ethan's lawyer tried to shake. Claire tried to cast her as a bitter ex-wife, hungry for revenge. But every question he asked, she answered with the same unshakable calm, and every answer made his client look worse. She never raised her voice. She never took the bait. She simply told the truth over and over, in a voice so steady it made the accusations of bitterness sound absurd. Eventually, the lawyer sat down because it had become clear that Claire on the stand was not a weapon he could turn. She was a wall he could only survive by stopping the conversation as fast as possible. Ethan chose not to testify in his own defense. His lawyers advised against it, and for the first time in his life, Ethan listened to advice about fine print. He had finally understood far too late that his charm couldn't save him from the truth. Not with Claire in the building. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Those were long days for Claire. She didn't attend court while they waited. She went to work to her company and tried to lose herself in the things she'd built. But she found her mind drifting back to the courtroom again and again, to Ethan's collapsed shoulders, to the wet shine in his eyes when she'd called him a confession. She didn't want him to suffer. She realized that somewhat to her own surprise, sitting alone in her office on the second night. She'd wanted justice. She'd wanted the truth spoken out loud. But she took no pleasure in the thought of the boy from the freezing apartment sitting in a cell. Grief, she was learning, doesn't follow the rules you'd like it to. You can be completely finished with a person and still mourn them. The verdict came on a Thursday afternoon. Guilty. Guilty on securities fraud. Guilty on wire fraud. Guilty on making false statements to investors. Guilty, 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 the word, falling like the letters of his name coming down off the building one by one by one. Ethan Caldwell was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison. He didn't look surprised when they read it. He'd stopped being surprised weeks ago. He simply nodded once and let them lead him away. And as he passed the gallery, he searched the crowd for Claire's face. She wasn't there. She'd left after her testimony. She had no wish to watch him fall. She'd never wanted to watch him fall. She'd only ever wanted to stop being the thing he fell on. 3 days after the verdict, a letter arrived. It came from the county jail where Ethan was being held before his transfer. Handwritten on cheap paper, his familiar slanted script filling both sides of the page. Margaret advised her not to read it. Claire read it anyway. Some part of her needed to close the door properly, and you can't close a door you refuse to look at. "Claire," it began, "I know you'll probably never read this, and if you do, I know it changes nothing. It shouldn't change anything. But I have a great deal of time to think now, and there's something I have to say even if it's only to myself. You were right about everything. I've spent my whole life needing to be the smartest man in the room. I don't even know where it started. Maybe I was afraid that if I wasn't the smartest, I was nothing at all. And you were actually brilliant. And instead of feeling grateful, I felt threatened. So I told myself a story where I was the one who mattered, and you were just the woman who supported me. I told it so many times, I believed it. I believed it right up until the day it cost me everything. I remember the apartment, the broken heater, you in those gloves typing all night. You told me once that we were going to build something together and that you didn't care if the world ever knew your name as long as we did it together. And I took the together and I threw it away a piece at a time until you were standing outside my office door listening to me call you simple. I didn't lose you that day, Claire. I finally worked that out. I lost you 1,000 small days before every single time I let you carry me and told myself I was carrying you. You didn't leave me when I made a mistake. You left me the moment you realized I'd never once seen you at all. You said that to me in the hotel lounge. I've thought about it every day since. I'm not writing to ask for anything. There's nothing left to ask for. I just needed you to know that I finally understand what I did. Not the fraud. The other thing. The bigger thing. I had the best person I've ever known standing right beside me, and I spent 12 years making her feel small because I was too weak to stand next to someone great without needing to stand on top of her. I'm sorry. For all of it. You deserved a partner. I gave you a passenger who called himself the driver. Be happy, Claire. You were always going to build something that lasted. I was just lucky enough to stand in front of it for a while, and too stupid to know that was already more than I deserved. Ethan. Claire read the letter twice. Then she set it down and sat for a long time in the quiet of her office. She didn't cry. She'd done her crying months ago in private for the marriage she'd only imagined she had. But something loosened in her chest as she read his words, some final knot of anger dissolving into something quieter. Not forgiveness, exactly. She wasn't sure she owed him that, and she wasn't sure he was asking for it. But an ending, a real one. The kind you can only have when the other person finally tells the truth, even if they tell it far too late to matter. She thought about not answering. And then she thought about the boy in the freezing apartment, and she took out a pen and she wrote just 3 lines. Ethan, thank you for finally seeing me. It's 12 years too late, and it changes nothing. But I'm glad you understand at last. I hope you find a way to build a smaller, truer life than the one you lost. Goodbye. Claire. She had it delivered, and she never heard from him again, and she found somewhat to her surprise that she was at peace with that. The weeks after the trial moved quickly. With Ethan gone and the legal wreckage cleared, Claire turned her full attention to the company she now controlled. And she made a decision that stunned everyone around her, including Alexander. She decided not to keep it. I don't understand, Alexander said when she told him over dinner. He set down his glass and stared at her. You fought for this. You built the technology it runs on. You took it back from a man who stole it. And now you want to sell it? Why? Because I didn't take it back to run it, Claire said. I took it back because it was mine and because a man who called me simple didn't deserve to keep standing on my work. That was the point. Not to own his company. To end it. She shook her head slowly. But this will always be Ethan's company, Alexander. In a way that can't be scrubbed off. His name was on it for 12 years. His shadow is in every wall of that building. Every corridor remembers the version of me that stood quietly in the background while he took the applause. She looked at him. I don't want to inherit his shadow. I've lived in it long enough. Alexander was quiet, watching her. So what do you want? I want to build something new, Claire said. Something that's mine from the very first brick. Something with my name on it from the first day, not painted over someone else's failure. I've spent my entire career letting a man take my name off my work. Her voice was quiet, but absolutely certain. I'm done. Whatever I build next, the whole world is going to know exactly whose it is. Alexander studied her for a long moment. And then slowly, a smile spread across his face. The smile of a man watching someone become fully finally themselves. You want to start over, he said. I want to start clean, Claire said. I'll sell Caldwell Innovations, take the capital, and build something on honesty instead of theft. A company where the quiet engineer working alone at midnight gets seen, where credit goes to the person who earned it, where partnership actually means partnership. She met his eyes. I know how to build the technology. I always did. What I never had was permission to put my name on it. This time I'm giving myself permission. And what will you call it? Alexander asked, though something in his face said he already knew. Claire didn't hesitate. Bennett Technologies, she said. Just my name. Nothing borrowed, nothing stolen, nothing to hide behind. A small, quiet smile touched her lips. For the first time in my life, I'm going to build something in the light. And I'm going to sign it. They sold Caldwell Innovations 2 months later for a figure that made national headlines. The strange poetic truth of it was that the technology alone, the technology Claire had built with her own hands in a freezing apartment, was valued at more than the entire company had ever been worth under Ethan's leadership. The buyer kept the old name for legacy reasons, but everyone in the industry understood the real story now. The genius had never been Caldwell. It had always been Bennett. And with the capital from that sale, Claire began to build again. They were good months, the building months. She rented real space, hired real engineers, and for the first time in her entire career, she led openly as herself, her name on every document and every decision she made. She discovered something she hadn't expected. She wasn't only a brilliant engineer, she was a natural leader. The same patience and clarity that had carried her through 12 years of silence made her extraordinary at guiding people. The engineers she hired came to adore her. She gave credit generously, listened more than she spoke, and never once made anyone in her company feel small. She built the kind of place she'd always wished she'd been allowed to work in. "You know what's strange?" she told Alexander one evening, months into the new company, as they sat together looking out over the city. "For 12 years, Ethan told me I didn't understand the real world, and now I'm running one of the fastest-growing technology companies in the country, and it turns out I understand it just fine." She laughed softly. "The real world was never the problem. He was just the only part of it I'd let define me." "You were always more than he could see," Alexander said. "That was never a reflection on you, Claire. It was a limit in him. Small men can only measure the size of things they're able to stand over. You were always too big for him to measure, so he told himself you were small. It was the only way he could keep feeling tall next to you." Claire looked at him for a long moment. He'd stayed close through all of it. Not as an investor now, though he'd put capital into Bennett Technologies too, but as something harder to name. A partner, a friend, a man who from the very first day they'd met at MIT had seen her clearly and had never once wanted her to be anything less than exactly what she was. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "That night years ago when you told me to call you if I ever got tired of watching Ethan take credit for my work, did you know it would come to this?" Alexander considered the question honestly. "I knew Ethan would eventually destroy himself," he said. "Men like him always do. It was only ever a matter of time before his own arrogance caught up with him." He turned to face her. "But no, I didn't say it because I was planning anything. I said it because it made me angry. Every single time I saw that man's face on a magazine cover taking credit for work, I knew in my bones he couldn't have done it. Made me furious. Not for the company, for you." He paused. "I couldn't stand watching the most brilliant person I'd ever known be treated like a decoration by a man who wasn't fit to carry her notebooks. I told you to call me because I needed you to know that at least one person on this earth saw the truth of who you were." Claire was quiet for a moment. "You've always seen me," she said softly. "Even back at MIT when everyone else in that program looked at me and saw a pretty girl who was good with computers. You looked at me and saw an engineer." "I looked at you and saw the best mind in the building," Alexander said simply. "I never understood how anyone could look at you and see anything less." And in the quiet that settled between them after that, something shifted gentle and unhurried the way real things grow. It wasn't the desperate, dazzling spark Claire had once felt for Ethan, the kind that blinds you to everything, including who a person really is. This was steadier, warmer, the kind of connection that grows slowly between two people who respect each other completely, who have nothing to prove to one another and nothing at all to hide. Claire didn't rush toward it. She'd learned the hard way what happened when you handed your whole heart to someone who saw you as a convenience. But she let herself feel it. And she let herself begin to believe carefully that maybe after everything she'd finally found someone who wanted to stand beside her, not in front of her. A year and a half after the day she'd stood outside an open office door with a cold lunch going colder in her hands, Claire Bennett stood at the front of her own company on the morning of its first major product launch, looking out at a room full of engineers and employees who had chosen to follow her. Not because her name was famous, because they had come to trust the woman who carried it. Alexander stood at the back of the room, watching her with a quiet pride he made no attempt to hide. Margaret Cole sat in the front row, the mentor whose single piece of advice given 15 years earlier to a young woman about to sign her life over to a charming man had in the end saved absolutely everything. And Claire, who had spent 12 years being invisible, stepped forward to speak as herself in a room where no one would ever again mistake the foundation for the decoration. She looked out at all those faces waiting for her. She thought of the girl in the fingerless gloves typing through the cold, believing her worth was something a man would one day hand to her, and she smiled because that girl had been wrong about that and right about everything else. She had built something that would last, and this time her name was on it. The launch became a phenomenon. Within weeks, Bennett Technologies had done in months what most companies spent years chasing, and the industry that had once celebrated Ethan Caldwell now turned its full attention to the woman it had overlooked for more than a decade. But Claire had learned something in the year since she'd stood outside that open door, and she carried it with her into every triumph that followed. Success wasn't the point. Being seen wasn't even the point. The point was building something true in the light with her own name on it and never again handing the only thing that was hers to someone who'd call it his. 6 months after the launch, Bennett Technologies filed to go public. It was Alexander who first raised the idea over dinner one evening. "You know what this means," he said. "If you take the company public, you'll ring the bell at the New York Stock Exchange. Your name, in front of the entire financial world." He watched her carefully. "The same world that spent 12 years thinking you were a decoration." Claire was quiet for a moment. "I'm not doing it for them," she said. "I know," Alexander said, "but maybe do it anyway, not to prove anything to the people who doubted you, just to let the girl in the fingerless gloves finally stand where she always deserved to stand." He reached across the table. "She earned it, Claire. Let her have it." And so, on a cold, bright morning in New York, Claire Bennett stood on the balcony above the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, waiting to ring the opening bell. The room below was packed. Traders, reporters, executives, the entire machinery of American finance, all of it, turned toward the woman at the podium. Cameras flashed. Somewhere in the crowd, Margaret Cole stood watching the woman whose single piece of advice 15 years earlier had quietly made this entire moment possible. And beside Claire, exactly where he'd chosen to stand, one step back and to the side, letting her have the light without ever once trying to step into it, stood Alexander Whitmore. It struck Claire in that final moment before she rang the bell how completely her life had reversed. A year and a half ago, she'd stood behind a man who took the spotlight and gave her the shadows. Now she stood in the spotlight, and the man beside her had chosen the shadow not because he belonged there, but because he understood that this moment was hers. And a man who truly respects a woman knows the difference between standing next to her and standing on her. That was the difference between Alexander and Ethan. It had always been that simple. One had wanted to own her light. The other was content to stand in it beside her. Claire looked out over the trading floor, and for one suspended moment, she let herself remember all of it. The freezing apartment, the broken heater, the gloves, the nights she'd spent building something out of nothing, while a boy she loved slept in the next room dreaming of the credit he'd one day take, the awards she'd watched from the audience, the galas where she'd squeezed his hand and said nothing while he said, "I built this," the dinner where he'd called her simple, the open door, the cold lunch, the laughter. And she remembered the moment she'd turned and walked to the elevator calm as still water and decided to stop being a fool. Every step from that door had led to this balcony. She pressed the button. The bell rang out across the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, sharp and clear and final, and the room erupted. Bennett Technologies opened on the public market, and within minutes, its value climbed past anything Caldwell Innovations had ever reached because the world had finally fully understood a truth that Ethan had spent 12 years hiding. The genius had a name, and the name was Bennett. The photographs from that morning ran everywhere. The image that spread furthest, the one that ended up on magazine covers and news sites around the world, was a single shot of Claire. At the moment the bell rang, her hand still raised her face, lit with a quiet, unshakable confidence that had nothing to prove and nothing to hide. It was the face of a woman who had been underestimated her entire life and had stopped at last caring whether anyone underestimated her again. The caption beneath it, in the largest business publication in the country, read simply, "The Architect." Not the CEO's wife, not the woman behind the man. The architect. the one who'd designed it all from the beginning, whose blueprints the whole empire had been built on, whose name the world had finally learned to read. Claire kept a copy of that magazine, not out of vanity. She kept it because somewhere out there was a girl in fingerless gloves who'd once believed her worth depended on someone else being willing to see it, and Claire wanted that girl to know finally that she'd been enough all along. She thought about Ethan sometimes. He was still in prison serving his 6 years. She didn't visit. She didn't write again after the 3 lines she'd sent. But she heard things the way you hear things about a person whose life was once tangled up with yours. She heard that he'd changed in the small ways a person can change when everything they built their identity on has been stripped away. She heard he'd started teaching a basic computer literacy class to other inmates, and that for the first time in his life, he was in a room where he was genuinely helping people without needing anyone to call him a genius for it. She heard he'd stopped telling the story where he was the victim. She hoped it was true, not because she owed him anything, but because she'd loved him once, really loved him. And there was a small, stubborn corner of her heart that still wished the boy from the freezing apartment could find some smaller, truer version of the life he'd thrown away. Not the empire, just peace, just honesty, just the ability finally to be an ordinary man who didn't need to be worshipped to feel like he mattered. That was the thing she understood now that she hadn't understood before. Ethan hadn't been a monster. He'd been something sadder and more human than that. He'd been a frightened man who could only feel tall by making the people around him feel small. And the tragedy of his life wasn't that he'd lost the company or the marriage or even his freedom. The tragedy was that he'd had right there beside him for 12 years a person who loved him exactly as he was, and he'd never been able to believe he was worth loving without stealing something first. He'd been standing next to the best thing that would ever happen to him, and he'd spent the whole time looking in a mirror. Claire didn't hate him for it anymore. She'd meant what she said on the stand. You can't hate someone you finally see clearly. She just felt the quiet grief of understanding, and then she let it go, and she got on with the business of living the life he'd never been able to give her. That life grew fuller with each passing season. Bennett Technologies flourished, but Claire made sure it never became the kind of place Caldwell Innovations had been. She built a culture where credit flowed to the people who earned it, where the quiet engineer working alone at night was seen and valued, where no one ever had to stand in someone else's shadow to keep their job. She created scholarships for young women in engineering, especially the ones who reminded her of herself, brilliant and overlooked, and convinced their silence was a flaw. She told them all the same thing. Your quiet is not your weakness, she'd say. It's just your power waiting for the right moment to speak. Don't ever let anyone convince you that being underestimated means you should be. The day you decide to stand up straight is the day they find out what you were carrying all along. And her relationship with Alexander deepened slowly, the way she'd always known real things had to grow. They married in a small ceremony 2 years after the launch, nothing like the grand affair she'd had with Ethan. Just a few dozen people, the ones who mattered. Margaret gave a toast that made the whole room laugh and then made half of it cry. And when Claire looked at the man standing across from her promising to build a life beside her, she felt none of the dazzled, blinded rush she'd felt as a young woman. She felt something better. She felt safe. She felt seen. She felt like a whole person standing next to another whole person, with nothing owed and nothing hidden, and nothing to hold each other up but the simple, steady choice to stay. You know, she told him on their wedding night, for a long time I thought love was supposed to feel like it did with Ethan. Overwhelming, consuming, like drowning in something bright. She looked at him. It took me losing everything to understand that wasn't love. That was just need. Real love doesn't make you disappear. It makes you more yourself. You were always yourself, Alexander said, even when the whole world was telling you to be less. That's the thing I fell in love with, Claire. Not that you rose up. That you were always great even when you were invisible. The rising was just the world catching up to what I already knew. She rested her head against his shoulder. And for the first time in her adult life, Claire Bennett had nothing left to prove to anyone, including herself. Years passed, good years. Bennett Technologies became one of the most respected companies in the country, and Claire became something she'd never once imagined as that shivering girl in the fingerless gloves, one of the most admired entrepreneurs in America. She was interviewed, celebrated, studied in business schools. Young engineers put her picture on their walls. And through all of it, she remained exactly who she'd always been, quiet, precise, kind, impossible to rattle. The only thing that had changed was that the world had finally learned to see her. One evening near the end of a long and satisfying career, Claire was invited to speak at a conference for young women entering the technology field. Hundreds of them filled the hall, bright-eyed and hungry, at the very beginning of the road she'd already walked to its end. And when she took the stage, she didn't talk about algorithms or acquisitions or stock prices. She told them a story. "A long time ago," she began, "I was married to a man who believed I was simple. He built a company, or so the world thought, and I was the quiet woman who stood behind him at the parties. People looked at me and saw a wealthy man's decoration, someone who got lucky, someone who didn't understand how the real world worked." She smiled. "They were wrong, but for a long time I let them be wrong because I'd been taught that a woman's worth was something a man handed to her, and I was waiting for mine to be handed over." The room was silent. "And then one afternoon I stood outside a door and heard the man I loved tell someone that I was a burden, that my kindness was weakness, that my silence meant I was powerless." She paused. "And in that moment I had a choice. I could break the way he expected me to, or I could finally understand something I'd known all along and been too afraid to believe." She looked out over the hundreds of young faces. "I could understand that I had never been standing behind him," Claire said. "I had been holding him up the entire time. And the difference between those two things is the difference between a decoration and a foundation." Her voice was steady and clear. "He thought that if he pushed me away, I would fall. But foundations don't fall when you push them. The building falls. And when I finally stepped back, the whole thing he'd built on top of me came down, and everyone finally saw what had been holding it up all along." She let the words settle over the room. "So here's what I want you to carry out of this room tonight," she said. "If someone ever tells you that your quiet is weakness, don't believe them. If someone ever makes you feel like you're standing in their shadow, remember that shadows only exist because something is blocking the light. And if someone ever mistakes your kindness for softness, they can walk on, let them. Let them make that mistake, because the people who underestimate you are handing you the greatest advantage there is. They will never see you coming." A few people in the audience were crying now. Claire went on gentler. "I lost a husband. I lost a marriage I thought was real. For a while I thought I'd lost everything." She shook her head slowly. "But I hadn't. I'd only lost the person who was standing in the way of my own light, and the day he pushed me away was the day I finally discovered how much of that light had been mine all along." She smiled, and there was no bitterness in it, only a deep and settled peace. Sometimes losing someone isn't the end of your story. Sometimes it's the moment you finally begin to write it yourself. The hall rose to its feet, and Claire Bennett stood at the front of the room, an old woman now successful beyond anything that trembling girl in the freezing apartment could ever have dreamed, and she understood that her whole life had turned on a single moment. A door left open, a cruel word spoken in careless laughter. A man who believed her silence meant she was powerless. He had been so certain that he'd built the empire, so certain that she was nothing without him, so certain that if he pushed her aside she would crumble. He had been wrong about all of it, because Claire Bennett had never been the woman behind the man. She had never been simple, never been a burden, never been the decoration the world mistook her for. She had been the architect of everything, the foundation beneath it all, the quiet force holding up a man who was too blinded by his own reflection to ever see her. And when he finally pushed her away, believing he was discarding something weak and worthless, the whole world discovered the truth she had carried in silence for 12 long years. She had never needed him. He had needed her. And the day she walked away was the day she stopped being the strongest part of someone else's story and became the whole of her own. A person's quietness is never their weakness. Sometimes it is the greatest strength in the room waiting patiently for the moment to stand. And when that moment comes, when the quiet one finally decides to rise, the people who called her simple will learn too late that they were never standing above her. They were only ever standing on her. Claire Bennett stood up straight, and the whole world finally saw how powerful she had always been. This is a bonus chapter, an extended epilogue for everyone who stayed with Claire's story all the way to the end. If her journey has meant something to you, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Now let's see what happened after the world learned her name. 5 years passed. Bennett Technologies grew from a promising startup into one of the most respected names in American technology, and Claire grew with it into a version of herself that the frightened young woman in the freezing apartment could never have imagined. But if you had asked Claire in those years what she was proudest of, she would not have pointed to the revenue or the headlines or the offices that now filled 3 floors of a downtown tower. She would have pointed to the people. Because Claire had built something Ethan never could have. She had built a place where no one was invisible. Every young engineer who walked through her doors heard the same thing on their first day. The best idea in this company might come from the quietest person in the room, so we listen to everyone. And whoever solves the problem gets their name on the solution. Always. No exceptions. She meant it, and she enforced it, and word spread. Within a few years, Bennett Technologies had become the place the brilliant and overlooked came to be seen. The women who'd been told they were too quiet. The immigrants whose accents made people underestimate them. The odd gifted people who thought sideways and had spent their whole careers watching louder colleagues take credit for their work. Claire collected them all, and she gave them what no one had given her for 12 long years. She gave them the light. One of them was a young woman named Priya Nair. Priya reminded Claire so much of herself that it was almost painful. 26 years old, staggeringly gifted, and so convinced of her own smallness that she apologized before she spoke. She'd been passed over for promotions at her last 2 jobs, watching less talented men present her work as their own, and she'd come to Bennett Technologies half expecting the same treatment. In her first month, she solved a problem that had stumped the entire engineering team for 6 weeks. And when Claire asked in a full company meeting who had cracked it, Priya said nothing. She just looked down at her hands. Claire recognized that silence. She'd lived inside it for over a decade. So she did something that changed the course of Priya's life. "I already know who solved it," Claire said gently to the whole room. "I just wanted to see if she'd tell you herself." She looked at Priya. It was Priya. Every line of the fix was hers, and I want everyone in this company to remember her name because I've been doing this a long time, and I'm looking at one of the best engineers I've ever seen. Priya cried, right there in the meeting. She tried to hide it and couldn't. And afterward, she came to Claire's office, still wiping her eyes, and said, "Why did you do that? You didn't have to do that." Claire looked at her for a long moment. Then she told her a story about a girl in a freezing apartment, about fingerless gloves and a broken heater, about 12 years of watching someone else accept the applause for work she'd done in the dark, and about a door left open and a cruel word overheard and the long, hard road back to her own name. "I did it," Claire said quietly when she'd finished, "because someone should have done it for me 20 years ago, and no one did. So I promised myself that if I ever had the power, I'd make sure the quiet ones in my rooms never had to wait as long as I did to be seen." She smiled. "You're not going to spend 12 years being invisible, Priya. Not on my watch. Consider that a promise." Priya became one of Claire's closest colleagues, and eventually, years later, the chief technology officer of the entire company. But that first moment, that small act of a powerful woman refusing to let a quiet one disappear, was the one Priya would tell people about for the rest of her career. It was the day she understood that the way you're treated is not a verdict on your worth. Sometimes it's just a verdict on the people around you. Claire's marriage to Alexander deepened into something she'd stopped believing was possible. They'd married quietly 3 years into Bennett Technologies in a ceremony so small and unpretentious that the business press almost missed it entirely, which was exactly how Claire wanted it. She'd had the grand wedding once with Ethan, the one with 300 guests and a photographer from a magazine. She knew now that the size of a celebration has nothing to do with the size of a love. This time she wanted only the people who'd actually been there for her. Margaret, Priya, a handful of engineers who'd become like family, and Alexander standing across from her promising not to complete her because she was already complete but to walk beside her. That was the vow he wrote himself. "I don't want to be the man behind you," he said, his voice steady in the small room, "and I don't want to be the man in front of you. I've spent my whole life watching people try to stand on you or stand over you, and I never understood any of them because the only thing I ever wanted was to stand next to you and watch you become everything I always knew you were. So that's my promise. Not to hold you up because you were never falling, just to stand beside you for as long as you'll have me and be glad every single day that you let me." Claire, who had not cried at her own wedding, cried then. Because for 12 years, she'd been married to a man who needed her to be smaller so that he could feel large. And now she stood across from a man whose entire joy was watching her be as large as she truly was. She finally understood the difference between being needed and being loved. Ethan had needed her the way a building needs its foundation, silently, invisibly, taking it for granted right up until the moment it's gone. Alexander loved her the way you love the sky, not because it holds you up, but because it's vast and beautiful, and you're simply grateful to stand beneath it. They never had children of their own. They'd married later in life, and it wasn't the path meant for them. But their lives were full in a way that surprised them both. Claire's scholarship program grew into a foundation that sent hundreds of young women through engineering school, and many of those women came to think of Claire as something between a mentor and a mother. She spoke at their graduations. She kept their letters. Her office wall over the years filled up with photographs of young women in caps and gowns, each one holding a diploma, each one a girl who might have disappeared into someone else's shadow if Claire hadn't reached back to pull her into the light. And Ethan Claire heard about him now and then, the way you hear about the weather in a city you used to live in. He served his 6 years. He got out quieter than he'd gone, in thinner, grayer, stripped of everything that had once made him gleam. And to the surprise of everyone who'd known him at the height of his arrogance, he did not try to claw his way back to the top. He couldn't have, of course. His name was ruined, his fortune gone, the doors that had once opened for him now permanently closed. But something else had changed too, something deeper than circumstance. The prison years had done to Ethan what all his success never could. They had made him small enough to finally see clearly. He took a job when he got out teaching basic computer skills at a community center on the south side of Chicago. It paid almost nothing. The students were kids from struggling neighborhoods, retirees trying to learn email, immigrants building new lives, one keyboard stroke at a time, and Ethan, the man who had once demanded to be called a genius, who had needed the worship of boardrooms and magazine covers to feel like he existed, found something in that community center that he'd never found at the top of the world. He found that he could help people without needing them to tell him he was brilliant. He was good at it, patient in a way he'd never been patient before. The students loved him not because he was impressive, but because he was kind and present, and he seemed to genuinely care whether a 60-year-old woman finally learned to video call her grandchildren. He never told them who he'd been. He wasn't that man anymore, and he had no wish to be. He'd spent 12 years standing on a woman's genius and calling it his own, and now he spent his days teaching a widow how to open her photos. And somehow the second thing made him feel more like a human being than the first ever had. He never contacted Claire again. He'd meant what he wrote in that letter. There was nothing left to ask for, and he understood that the kindest thing he could do for her was to let her go completely. But he followed her from a distance, the way you follow the story of someone you once loved and wronged. He read about Bennett Technologies. He saw the photograph of her ringing the bell at the stock exchange, the one captioned, "The Architect." He read about her foundation, about the hundreds of young women she'd lifted up. And he was glad. That was the strange, redemptive thing. He was genuinely, purely glad. Whatever poison had lived in him for all those years, the thing that had made him need to diminish her in order to feel tall, the prison years and the community center and the long, quiet reckoning, had finally burned it out. He could look at her success now and feel no envy, no bitterness, no wish that any of it were his. Just gratitude that the woman he'd nearly destroyed had gone on to build a life so much larger and better than anything he could have given her. One afternoon, years after his release, a young woman came into his classroom at the community center. She was there to volunteer part of an outreach program run by a technology foundation. She was bright and kind and patient with the older students, and Ethan liked her immediately. It was only near the end of the day when she mentioned the name of the foundation that had sent her that Ethan's heart stopped for a moment. The Bennett Foundation. "You work for Claire Bennett?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. "I'm one of her scholarship kids," the young woman said proudly. "She put me through school. She's the reason I'm an engineer at all. She's—" The young woman searched for the words. "She's the most extraordinary person I've ever met. She sees people you know, really sees them. There are hundreds of us who'd have disappeared if she hadn't found us." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said softly. "I imagine she would. That sounds exactly like her." "Did you know her?" the young woman asked, curious. Ethan looked out the window for a moment at the ordinary street, at the small true life he'd built out of the wreckage of his old one. And he smiled, and there was no pain in it, only a kind of peace. "A long time ago," he said, "in another life. I knew her a little." He paused. "But I don't think I ever really saw her, not the way you're describing. That was my great mistake, actually. I had the chance to stand next to someone remarkable, and I was too foolish to understand what I was standing next to until it was gone." He turned back to the young woman, and his eyes were kind. "Can I give you some advice from an old man who learned it the hard way?" "Of course." "When you find yourself standing next to someone great," Ethan said, "don't ever try to make yourself feel bigger by making them feel smaller. Just stand there, be grateful, and help them shine. It's the only thing in this world worth doing, and I wasted half my life learning it." He smiled again. "Tell Claire Bennett she built something wonderful. Someone who used to know her says so." The young woman promised she would, though she never learned who the quiet, kind teacher at the community center had once been. And when she passed the message along to Claire without a name attached, "Just a stranger who used to know you says you built something wonderful," Claire went very still. She knew. Of course she knew. There was only one person in the world it could have been. She sat with it for the long moment, that message from a ghost, from the boy in the freezing apartment who had finally, at the very end, become a man who understood. And she found to her quiet astonishment that she was glad. Not for herself, for him. She'd hoped all those years ago, when she sent him 3 lines and a goodbye, that he might find a way to build a smaller, truer life. It seemed that he had. "Are you all right?" Alexander asked, watching her face. Claire was quiet for a moment. Then she smiled, and it was a smile with a whole lifetime folded inside it, grief and forgiveness and peace all at once. "I am," she said. "I really am. It's just—" She looked out at the city, at the lights coming on one by one, at the world she'd built for herself out of the ruins of the one she'd lost. "For a long time I needed him to understand what he'd done, not to punish him, just to know that I hadn't imagined it all, that I really had been what I knew I was." She turned to Alexander. "And now he understands. And it turns out I don't need anything from that understanding anymore. I stopped needing it years ago. It's just nice, that's all. It's nice to know the story ended somewhere true for both of us." She never contacted him. He never contacted her. Some doors once closed are meant to stay that way, and both of them understood it. But there was a kind of grace in that final wordless exchange. A stranger who used to know you says, "You built something wonderful," and its quiet answer carried back across the years. 2 people who had shared a freezing apartment and a broken dream, who had loved each other badly and then destroyed each other completely, had somehow both found their way to peace. Separately, as they were always meant to. Claire lived a long life, a full one. She led Bennett Technologies for 2 decades before handing it fittingly to Priya Nair, the quiet young engineer she'd refused to let disappear. She and Alexander grew old together in the easy, grateful way of 2 people who'd found each other later than they'd have liked and treasured every year all the more for it. And when she was very old and honored and asked 1,000 times to tell her story, she always told it the same way. Not as a story about a woman who was betrayed, not even as a story about revenge, though the world sometimes wanted to hear it that way. She told it as a story about a door. "Someone once left a door open," she would say to the young women who gathered to hear her, "and I heard something on the other side of it that broke my heart. He called me simple. He called me a burden. He said I didn't understand the real world. She would smile, that unshakable, peaceful smile. And for one terrible moment, standing in that hallway with his lunch going cold in my hands, I believed him. That's the part I want you to hear. Even I believed him for a moment. That's how powerful it is when someone tells you you're small. The room would always be silent, but then I walked away from that door, she would continue, and I discovered something that took me 12 years to learn, and that I want to give to you tonight for free. The people who tell you you're weak are not describing you. They're describing what they need you to be so that they can feel strong. Your quiet is not weakness. Your kindness is not softness. Your patience is not stupidity. Those are your strengths wearing clothes that let the foolish underestimate you. And the day you stop believing the people who need you small. She would pause and look out at all those bright, hungry faces, each one a girl who reminded her of herself. That's the day you find out you were never behind anyone at all. You were holding the whole thing up. And when you finally decide to stand up straight, everyone finds out exactly how strong you always were. And every time the room would rise to its feet, because they understood. They were the quiet ones, the overlooked ones, the ones who'd been told their softness was weakness and their silence was small. And here was a woman who had been all of those things, who had been called simple by a man who then took credit for her genius and who had walked away from an open door and built an empire, a foundation, a legacy, and a love that saw her exactly as she was. She had lost everything once in a hallway holding a cold lunch, and she had gained the whole world by discovering it had been inside her the entire time. Claire Bennett had never been the woman behind the man. She had never been simple. She had never been weak. She had been the architect of everything, the foundation beneath it all, the quiet, unbreakable force that a foolish man mistook for a shadow. And when he finally pushed her away, certain she would crumble, she did not crumble. She rose. She rose so high and so bright that the whole world had to look up to see her, and every quiet, overlooked, underestimated person watching learned the truth that her life had proven beyond any doubt. A person's silence is never their weakness. It is their strength waiting for the right moment to stand. And Claire Bennett stood at last in the full light of her own making, and she never sat back down again.